And joining us now on the debate, from Dallas, Texas, Major Stephen Gallagher, Canadian Forces Liaison Officer at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. In Calgary, Alberta, Carly Porat, who served with the Israeli Defense Forces, is now a student at the University of Calgary. And Anne Irwin, that's Anne on the left, a military anthropologist with the Centre for Military and Strategic Studies at the University of Calgary. In Kingston, Ontario, Karen Davis, specialist in gender and diversity issues with the Canadian Forces Leadership Institute. And of course, we welcome back Chris Waddy, embedded reporter in Afghanistan and the author of Contact Charlie. And as I welcome everybody in many different locations for this discussion about women in the military, I want to start, since you've all served in Canada, the U.S., and Israel, with a comparison of the numbers in Canada, the U.S., and Israel. And let's start with Canada. Michael, if you would, we'll bring these facts up right now. About 15% of the Canadian Forces personnel are women. About 2% of Canadian regular force combat troops are women. That's about 99 female combat officers. 7,900 women are currently serving in the regular force. 4,800 women are serving in the primary reserve. The size of the Canadian military is between 60 and 62,000, and in the reserves between 20 and 25,000. And of course, most people know we've got 2,500 or so soldiers in Afghanistan today. Now, how about in the United States? Women make up 14% of the Army's active forces there, and about 2.5% of female conscripts, according to the Army figures, and that's about comparable to what Canada's doing as well. How about in Israel? Quite different. Israeli women make up a third, 33% of the country's forces, because they have compulsory service over there. That's about twice as much as our average here and America's. And women in combat make up 3.5% of personnel, a little higher than what we've got here in Canada or in the United States. I want to start by just going around the horn and everybody giving us 20 seconds on their own personal history, because you've all served in the armed forces. So Major Steve Gallagher in Dallas, why don't you start us off? Tell us how long you've been in and where you are right now.
I'm serving right now in Fort Sill, Oklahoma as the Canadian Forces Liaison Officer. I've been in the Canadian Forces for 24 years and served in Afghanistan from January to August of 2006. And interestingly enough, I had 7 women in my battery while deployed, so 7% females.
So that's higher than normal then, okay. Anne Irwin in Calgary, tell me your story.
Well, I served in the Canadian Forces Reserve from '72 to 1987, and then ending up as a military police officer, so not combat. And then since then, I've been conducting research on the military and have been studying the infantry since 1992, including 3 months in Afghanistan with Charlie Company, 1st Battalion Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, from May to August of 2006.
And do you ever have to fire a gun at anybody?
No.
Okay. Let's go to Kingston.
But I've been shot at.
You have been shot at, okay.
Yes.
More on that in a bit. Karen Davis in Kingston, tell me about you.
I joined the Canadian Forces in 1978 and retired in 2000. I was an oceanographic operator in the Navy for about 7 years of my career, and then became a personnel selection officer. So I have no combat experience. But as a personnel selection officer, part of my job was to conduct research on personnel-related issues. So I conducted the initial research study on women in the combat arms in the 1990s, when women first came into the combat arms in Canada.
Gotcha. Let's go back to Calgary. Carly, you were with the Israeli Defense Forces. Tell me about that.
That's correct. I served for 2.5 years between 2001 to 2004 as a combat soldier in the Israeli Defense Force anti-aircraft unit. So
how old were you when you did that?
I was 20 when I joined the Army, and I guess I was probably 20, just about 23 when I was released from active duty.
Now you're a Canadian citizen, right?
Yeah, I was born and raised in Calgary.
So why'd you go over there?
I originally went over there after high school just to learn the language, and I sort of identified a little bit with the culture, and because, as you mentioned, service is mandatory over there, I kind of thought if I ever wanted to live there permanently that it would be useful to have served in the Army as everyone else there does.
Did you see combat?
Well, our unit is special because I joined basically a week before the September 11th attacks, and in fact my unit would have been the exact unit that is on guard and would be responsible for shooting down any plane that attacked. So after that incident, we were pretty much on considered on alert for our job all the time. And I was also there during periods of heavy suicide bombing. So when you go home for the weekend, there's also more action to be had.
Right. Karen, let me come back to you. I wonder if you could talk to us for a moment just about how the role of women in the armed forces has evolved, say, over the last 25 years or so.
It started with the Royal Commission on the Status of Women in 1969. The recommendations resulting from the Royal Commission basically laid the groundwork for where women are today in the Canadian Forces. They made 5 recommendations, and one of them was to integrate women into all of the occupations in the Canadian Forces. That didn't happen at the time, but several things did move forward. In 1978, again with the upcoming Canadian Human Rights Act, the Canadian Forces again was looking at some pressure from the perspective of human rights to put women into more occupations and create more opportunities. After that, they conducted the service women in non-traditional environments and roles trials, and that was to determine what impact women would have on the all-male units in the Canadian Forces at the time. Again, women were integrated into more occupations, but not all occupations and roles. In 1986, the Canadian Forces conducted the Charter Task Force on Equality, again looking at the issue of women in near combat and combat roles. By now they knew that the main challenge was the attitudes of men in the units towards women, that the Swinter trials established that women were quite capable of doing the job. By 1989, again, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal looked at the Canadian Forces and at this point ruled that they would integrate women into all environments and roles. So that's late 1989 and forward, that's when we started to see women in the combat arms and a couple of the other occupations that women hadn't been in until that time.
Gotcha. Were there women, when you were embedded over there, were there women in your unit as well?
Yeah, including Captain Nicola Goddard, who served under Major Gallagher's battery.
Hold off, we're going to come to her because she's, of course, a special case, having been the only female casualty so far.
And I've seen and been around women in all sorts of different combat arms situations. The combat arms are the frontline army units, the artillery, the armored, and of course the infantry, the combat engineers.
Do the genders serving together work?
It's kind of surprising that yes. You wouldn't think it's a little counterintuitive. You would think that having women in these roles, they would just be forced on the guys and there'd be a lot of resentment. But every combat arms unit I've seen with women integrated into it, if anything, the women are like more hardcore, is the expression, than the guys. They just get right into it, take up the culture, and whether it's the swearing and the tall stories telling. The women, it's actually remarkable how easily they fit in and how quickly the guys accepted them.
And I've only known you for 5 minutes, but my hunch is you're not more macho and more swearing than most of the guys you served with, unless I'm dead wrong about that.
Well, they might beg to quibble with you, actually. No, I'd absolutely agree with Chris. The bottom line for the military is, can you do the job? Can you do your bit, and will you watch my back? And that's really, they're very pragmatically oriented. As long soldiers, that's what they care about. Can you do the job? Are you going to back me up? And all the rest of it doesn't really matter. And somehow we've got this idea that there's something not feminine, or not, that women don't enjoy the give and take, the joking. There's no reason why women can't enjoy that or partake in that the same way men do. Yeah, I haven't seen any problems with women. And there were, when I was over in Afghanistan, there were a couple of women in the platoon, or in the company that I was working with, and they were completely fully integrated and accepted by the guys.
Okay, I take your point on that, but I want to follow up on one thing, which is I'm guessing the average male soldier is going to be something like, 5, 9, 10, 11, 12, 6 feet, 6'1", 6'2", something like that, 180 pounds. And I'm guessing most of the women are, physically smaller. How do the women convince the men that they've got their backs and that they're equal partners to all the tasks when, frankly, they're physically smaller?
Well, they're not all physically smaller. There are some small guys. There are some big women. But it's not always about physical brawn. Some of the guys are not as physically fit as they should be, and what they do is they muscle through. it's more about mental toughness and dominating your body and just doing the work. And the women who have chosen to be in the combat arms tend to be able to do that every bit as well as the men. Otherwise, they wouldn't have got where they are.
Okay,
they would not be deployed overseas if they weren't able to succeed in that role to begin with.
I take your point, and I see a fairly positive review from everybody as I go around the horn. So I want to go to Karen and ask this question. We're getting very positive reviews on how the genders mix today in combat, in the field. What was it like when women first entered the force, as you told us back in 1989, 1990?
Well, of course, back in the early days of women in the combat arms, it was not near as positive a story. But I think it's important to remember, one, a lot of the women that we talked to at that time were the women who had left, because women were 5 times more likely than men to leave the combat arms. And the Chief of the Land Staff wanted to know why. And I think I agree also with what Anne said, in that they wouldn't be deployed to Afghanistan if they hadn't already proven that they could do the job. So the women I suspect the women that you're seeing in Afghanistan are the top performers. The challenge for me would be the recruiting process, the training process, and how women move through that process and get to where they are in Afghanistan.
Steve, I'm told you've got a story about showering that explains some of how men and women get along in the field. You want to tell us that?
Certainly. That'll get everyone's attention, that's for sure. When we first moved into Kandahar Airfield, it was pretty austere, to say the least, and Chris can attest to that. And they had just set up showers, and one was clearly identified as female only. And I had one of my female gunners showering, and it was so austere that they didn't even have a shower curtain. And 3 soldiers, male infantry soldiers, walked in on her. And I would say the average person would say, "Oh, sorry," turn around and get the heck out of there. But these guys did not do that. And that was totally unacceptable. And at the time, myself and my sergeant major went to the commanding officer and said, you know, we've got to do something about this. His first reaction was to segregate the women in the quarters. And that didn't go over so well with Captain Nicola Goddard, who was probably the senior female in Afghanistan at the time. And she went right to Colonel Hope, right around me, and addressed her concerns to him. And after listening to her, he reconsidered the issue, and the women were not segregated or split aside in the quarters.
So the gist of it at the end of the day was everybody together?
And certainly that behavior was unacceptable, and you know, we didn't find out who those guys were, but it was addressed, and it didn't happen again. But yeah, it was all for one, one for all, and we're all on one team, and that was unacceptable.
Chris, based on what you saw, how did those kinds of issues resolve themselves?
My experience, the guys sort this stuff out themselves. Most of the people, particularly in Task Force Orion, most of the people are good soldiers. They're good guys. Any large group, you're going to get your percentage of jerks, frankly. And but by and large, people like the battery sergeant major would certainly sort that out. I'm sure Steve would attest to that. The senior NCOs will take care of that. It's not all a rosy picture. I mean, for the most part, yeah, women are accepted within combat arms units. There have been allegations of sexual abuse, sexual harassment. As I said, any large organization, there is going to be a small percentage of guys that just frankly shouldn't be in there. But for the most part, something like that happens. Usually the sergeant majors are pretty quick to sort it out.
Karen, as you've studied this, is there a disproportionate amount of difficulty between the genders in the armed forces compared to any other institution or company in our society?
I would have to say, if I go back to the 90s, definitely there were disproportionate problems. And at that time, the good guys, or the ones that were supportive of the women, seemed to be more the minority. But I think that has shifted. But I still would expect that when you get into isolated locations, that you're operating in an entirely different environment than someone who's working in an organization in Canada, for example, where all the safeguards are in place, the harassment policy, the advisors, the people to help out. So I think that when women do run into difficulties in a situation like Afghanistan, the challenges that they're up against are much more difficult if that positive leadership isn't ready to act quickly on the issues, and we have had some challenges in that regard.
And Steve, let me get you to I'm sorry, somebody else was trying to get in. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to just point out that we tend to compare the military with sort of not a very accurate comparison, because particularly if you're talking about the combat arms, a better comparison would be to look at how many women, or what are the women's experience in profession, well, not even professions, but in jobs like oil rig worker or logger, or, you know, we shouldn't be comparing particularly the combat arms with women in, say, industry in a city, you know, in the city of Calgary, or how women are doing in particular those kinds of industries, like working in an office.
Although, Anne, I think some people would make the point that the disparity between men and women, you know, at the highest ranks of corporate Canada, for example, is just about the same as it is in the military.
Yes, indeed. But I'm talking more in terms of the entry level, the people down at the type of job, the kind of physical demands, the kind of. So if you were to look at how women are treated, you know, a woman who's the only woman working on an oil rig, if you were able to find one, how she would be treated, and compare how women in the infantry are treated, for example, I think you might find that in fact the military, you know, they're actually quite very well accepted.
Okay, Steve, let me ask you about the other criticism we hear, which is that in higher echelon areas of the military, it's harder for women to move up than it is for men. You don't see a lot, although, you know, it did happen 2 weeks ago in the U.S. We did see, I think, our first, not our first, their first four-star female general appointed. But the allegation is that that's a pretty rare day in the high end of the military. Is that a fair comment?
I think it's going to come around, and as Karen and yourself were going over some of the statistics, 1989 wasn't that long ago. So I think we have seen women come along. We've had our first female battery commander in the artillery. I don't think the infantry has yet had a company commander, but it's not going to be far off. And I think they will succeed easily as we move on.
Carly, how about in the Israeli Defense Forces? Could you see women moving up into positions of real leadership as easily as the men did?
Well, I think to move into positions of real leadership in the Israeli army, you do more or less, the higher positions will follow a combat track. So because, as you said, there's only 3% of the women serving are in combat roles, just because of the fact that historically they haven't been there until now, that there probably aren't many of them. However, aside from the fact that somebody might have to leave for maternity leave or something like that, I think that if they had the proper experience. However, there are some units still where women don't serve, such as paratroopers, which is in Israel considered one of the more elite and prestigious units. So a lot of the prime ministers, for example, served in paratroopers, and if they don't have women in that unit, then I guess you could say that it would be harder for women to progress to the very high levels.
Gotcha. Let me spend a moment here on, I guess, the most contentious issue still to this day, which is women being allowed to engage in combat. Chris, how much of that did you see? How much of it was accepted by the guys?
I think absolutely it was accepted by the guys. It's understood that if a woman was part of a combat unit, or I saw a couple of cases where medics were attached to a particular platoon or a particular company, if they were part of the company and they were accepted, there was absolutely no problem with that. And I know Captain Goddard was actually held in extremely high regard by everyone at the Charlie Company. Almost everyone I talked to who had any sort of contact with Captain Goddard, and it's almost as if she was. She knew she had to try harder because she was one of the first female officers, and she impressed everyone with her professionalism, her enthusiasm. You know, she knew she was setting an example.
And if you wanted to compare America with Canada, any differences in women in combat and how well they're accepted?
I wouldn't like to say, well, I think they're better accepted in Canada because there are larger. I was under the understanding that women only don't serve actually in combat units in the United States. It's just that they may end up in combat because of the nature of counterinsurgency warfare. So, you know, so we're comparing apples and oranges. But I want to say something about Captain Goddard. I think the big problem isn't the people within the military, it's the people out, the media perceptions and the perceptions that civilians have of the military that are less accepting. And remember when Captain Goddard was killed, it was a big deal was made of the fact that she was the first Canadian woman to be killed in combat. But I don't think I ever saw anywhere mentioned that she was also the most senior person to be killed in Afghanistan at that point. The most senior, she was the first captain to be killed. And that was never mentioned. All that anyone focused on was the fact that she was a woman.
I think also when you're a soldier and you have a commander who's a woman who's in charge of you and you're subordinate to her, it doesn't matter if you're male or female. This is somebody who's training you and who's in charge of your life. So you kind of get educated to see, well, this is my superior, and I'm striving to be as capable as they are in the job. So you don't really get questions. You're already socialized to the fact that there are women who are good combat soldiers, so it's not even so much a question after a few years that women have been able to make it to levels that they're leading troops.
Chris?
Yeah, it's funny, Ann was mentioning, and first of all, thanks a lot for blaming me, Ann.
I'm not blaming you specifically, Chris.
But it's funny because I met Nick only sort of briefly in passing, and I know that she was avoiding people in my business like the plague, because she actually started to run away. It was at the Provincial Reconstruction Team camp, and
she didn't want the attention?
No, absolutely. She did not want to be singled out. She was part of the team.
She was an officer first. She wasn't a
exactly.
She wasn't a female officer. She was an officer.
She didn't want to be. She didn't want to be the poster child.
Right.
And I had to sort of say, no, it's okay, Nick. I'm just talking to you. I'm not going to do the woman soldier feature that she dreaded. I mean, military units are so tightly knit that they avoid trying to look like they're playing themselves up. And she saw herself really as part of the team, and she didn't want to set herself aside. She wanted to be seen as an artillery officer and an officer first, and the fact that she was a woman was just happenstance.
Steve, I'm going to get you to comment because, of course, she was part of your unit in Afghanistan. But before I do, I want to read something the Ottawa Citizen reported May 18th, 2006. On this issue, and here it goes. The public's willingness to accept the death of Captain Nicola Goddard in Afghanistan will indicate whether Canadians can face the consequences of women in combat, the chief historian at the DND said yesterday. It is a reflection, really, on society, saying we have accepted the implications of gender integration, said Steve Harris, chief historian at DND's Directorate of History and Heritage. Do you agree with that, Steve?
It's really difficult to, and I remember reading a lot of those stories on the 18th of May and afterwards. And I know Nicola would like to have been remembered on the 17th of May as one of the first artillery observers since Korea to actually engage with artillery in a hostile environment aimed at the Taliban. And she would like to have been remembered for that as opposed to the first woman killed in combat. But it's hard to say what Canadian society will accept and what they won't. But an earlier point, I don't think the Canadian public is well informed of what the jobs are that women are doing and how essential they are in this counterinsurgency warfare.
I think that raises a really important point, though, the issue of public perception. If we look back to 1978, with the pending Canadian Human Rights Act, DND conducted a poll of Canadians to see if they would be accepting of women in combat. And there was roughly a 50-50 split on whether they could accept women being put in such a dangerous position. And when you look at the reporting after Nicola Goddard died, I think, in defense of the press, I think in many ways the press was quite neutral. I did a fairly detailed comparison to the reporting on Robert Castell when he died. And the only thing that I could really pick up that was a huge difference was one, as Anne mentioned, there was no to the fact that she was an officer and the first officer at the time. And but the other thing was there was a reluctance to accept her as a full-time soldier, as a career soldier. That there was often reference to the loss of a future leader when we talked about the loss of Robert Castell, for example. And with Nicola, it was she didn't get a chance to be a mother. She was talking about buying a house. There was more of a focus on what she was going to do after she was a soldier, even though her leadership was definitely recognized, her professionalism. Yeah. So, and Rosie DiMano of Toronto Star reported that for some reason it's just much harder to accept a woman dying in combat. So I think that there's a lot of political correctness out there, but some people are still really struggling with it.
Well, is it a good thing or a bad thing that we find it more difficult to accept the death of a female officer as opposed to a male one?
And can I also ask if the people who replied to the survey, supporting or not supporting, if they were men or women or both?
Well, it was a Gallup poll in 1978,
Okay.
a sampling of Canadians. Yeah.
Well, you know what? Let me take a step back here for a second, because Scott Taylor, whom I think all of you know, who spent a lot of time around the military and has written much and been quoted much on this issue, was quoted in the Western Standard back in 2005 in a piece called Battle for the Sexes. Here's what he said about some of which we've talked around today. Taylor believes fitness standards have been watered down to accommodate women, and that's hurting the Corps. It leads to poor morale, he says. It's one of those things that if anyone can join the club, and then what's the point of joining? Be all you can be used to be the motto. Now it's be anybody you want to be, just wear our uniform. Taylor has also accused the CF of attempting to accommodate women by having the lowest physical fitness standards of any military in the world. Okay, I know them's fighting words for a lot of you here, so let's get into that. Okay, Karen, you go first. Go ahead.
I think should respond to that.
Of course, I don't agree with Scott Taylor and the whole issue of lowering standards for women. I think that as gender integration moved along in the Canadian Forces, there were many lessons learned. So a lot of the things that they found out through the participation of women, for example, that different body types need different types of backpacks or packs made, different sizes of boots for female soldiers, realizing that there's different methods of training to make sure that you're trained to actually do the job and not just meet an arbitrary standard. So some of the standards were changed, but not lowered. They were changed to the benefit of the effectiveness of the force. And some people like to see that as lowered standards for the integration of women.
Steve, can I get your opinion on that? Changed versus lowered standards?
Well, I don't agree with a lot Scott Taylor has to say, but you know, the fitness test as it exists right now within the Army is 50-some pounds on your back and walk 13 kilometers, and that doesn't matter what size or what gender you are. And it's put the weight on and walk. And so, no, I don't agree with it. It is the same standard, and it's a pretty good standard.
Carly?
Yeah, I think basically we already covered the point that it comes down to basic ability, and every job has a specific level. So if I don't need to be trained for infantry, I need to be trained to be able to help carry out a wounded soldier, and I need to be able to do that just as any of the guys can do that. And I don't think, I mean, if the standards changed, like we were all still very capable of doing our job to meet the requirements of the force we work for.
And Chris, do the guys really believe that?
No, in fact, like most things Scott says, it may have been true once, but it's certainly not true now. Three years ago, General Rick Hillier, the recently retired Chief of Defense Staff, looked around him at National Defense Headquarters in Ottawa, saw a lot of soldiers that were out of shape, and said, we're going to make fitness a priority, and really did. And it wasn't, as Steve pointed out, there's no distinction between men and women. You put that 50 or 55 pounds of stuff on, you do 13 kilometers in 2 hours and 2 hours and a half, I think it is. And doesn't matter whether you're male or female. And they made fitness a real priority. In fact, it's interesting. I think most of the women, particularly the ones in combat arms units, do not want to get special treatment because they realize how it poisons the relationship with the rest of their comrades.
Interesting. Okay, we've got, sorry, Anne, did you want one quick word?
Yeah, I just want to say that back in the day, I think I'm the one here, the oldest person here, but I joined up in 1972, and back in those days, they had very, very different standards for women, and most of us resented that intensely because it made us a different category of person, and we were always subject to, we were always questioned about whether we could do it, whether we could do the job, and we would have much preferred to have had to meet the same standards so we could prove ourselves.
Gotcha. I want to, in our last 5 minutes or so here, get into something a little tricky. So humor me, everybody. Carly, do you think that the Canadian public is ready to accept the idea of women as both warrior and killer?
I don't think the Canadian public has much experience accepting males in that role either. So I'm not sure if that, basically people don't know what to make out of military experience in general, people assume that if you have to kill somebody that you're going to be traumatized, and whereas in real life, if you're killing somebody and it's obviously in defense, it's something that people who go through the military learn to deal with. They have to deal with. It's part of their job. And I wouldn't really, I don't know, I haven't given much thought to what Canadian society would think, although I do know that military service in general is just kind of a shocking topic to deal with for people, and kind of your number one question, if whatever army you've served in, is people want to know, have you killed anybody? And that's about it. Like, people don't even really know to ask questions. And like, if I tell somebody I was a combat soldier here, I usually get like a smile and a nod, like, oh, okay, I don't really know what that means, but.
I find it quite comical. The first question my 9-year-old son asked when I get off the bus, and I've been away for 7.5 months, I didn't come home during my leave, and the first question he said is, Dad, did you have to kill someone? And I wasn't really prepared for that question. But
What answer did you give him?
And that was interesting. Uncharacteristically, I think it was a pretty good one. I said, well, Blake, people shot at me, and they shot at me to kill me, and I shot back. And I thought he would be satisfied with that. And he said, well, did you hit him, Dad? And so I just had to say, well, he didn't shoot back at me, so I'm not sure. And I left it at that. But that might be an indication of the general Canadian public as well.
There is a fascination, though, and you're quite right, and I know I asked it myself off the top, whether any of you had to use your weapons in battle. And my guess is, and I have nothing to hang this on, so you tell me if I'm wrong, my guess is, Steve, people, to the extent they think about this, are cooler with the idea of you having to use your gun to kill somebody in a battle than they are with a woman doing so. They see that as somehow consistent with being a guy. They don't see it as consistent with being a woman. Now, maybe we need to change some attitudes at that, and Karen, maybe you could help me out with that. Where do you think I am on that?
I haven't seen any evidence that Canadians really make a distinction between a woman who has to kill someone in battle and a man. I think, as Carly mentioned earlier, that Canadians generally have difficulty with the idea of Canada being in a battle. So, you know, if you're against that, you're against men and women. I think the bigger challenge for some people is the fact that some women belong to this organization that's designed for male membership. I think it's more this discomfort with women being in the military and being away with men in isolated locations and doing things men do. But I don't think it necessarily comes down to whether a man or a woman needs to kill someone in battle.
Okay, just over a minute to go, Karen, and I want to try this. And if you think these questions have been uncomfortable, how about this one? Lindy Anglin, Abu Ghraib. People remember that it was a woman that was capable of doing some pretty terrible things in the field. Do people need to get used to the idea of women being capable of perversity in the field and not just men?
I think they have to be aware that once someone joins the military and becomes socialized into that culture and becomes exposed to many of the unusual things they become exposed to, that it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman.
Anne, can I get you on that?
Yeah, I think, you know, there are bad eggs, there are criminals in any organization, and you know, there's lots of evidence that women are every bit as capable of atrocious behavior as men are. And it shouldn't come as any surprise. People are, of course, are yes, certainly uncomfortable with it, but it shouldn't be surprising. You can see lots of evidence through history and cross-culturally of women being capable of horrific violence. But I don't think these criminals basically are representative of the entirety of the military. So I think it's a not a very good example in that way.
Understood.
Yeah.
That's our time, everybody. I want to thank you all for being so helpful with our understanding of this topic, women in the military. Can I thank, out of town, Major Steve Gallagher, who's on the line in Dallas, Texas, Carly Porat in Calgary, Ann Irwin in Calgary, Karen Davis in Kingston. It was good of all of you to join us on the line, and of course, Chris Waddy, the author of Contact Charlie. Good to have you here in studio, Chris. Pleasure to be with you as well.